Hello everyone, this is Bersan Gordado, Project Coordinator of Educational Services for the Association of Community Cancer Centers. I want to thank you for joining the ACCC Center for Provider Education on this live interactive webinar. This webinar is supported by an educational grant from Millennium, the Takeda Oncology Company. Today's webinar has been designed to be both practical and as well as informative. Please note that this webinar is being audio taped and will be archived online for your reference and to share with your colleagues. I want to provide you with a quick overview on how to ask questions and communicate with other participants and/or the presenter during the meeting. You will notice an Attendees tab at the top left corner of your screen. You will right-click the name of the person with whom you want to chat with and then select Chat. A chat box will appear and you will enter your comment or question in the box and click Send. You will be able to have multiple one-on-one chat sessions simultaneously. You will also notice on your screen a Q&A tab located at the top left corner of your screen. This is where you can ask the speaker questions. Please type your questions in the box and hit the Enter button. Your questions will only be seen by the speaker. This will allow you to ask questions throughout the presentation, and at the end of the session, we will also leave time for a Q&A. At this time, I would like to introduce our presenter for today's webinar. Our presenter for the webinar is Lou Lecovelli. Lou is an oncology pharmacy manager, a clinical pharmacy practitioner, clinical hemonc specialist, and the hemonc specialist specialty residency director at the Cone Health Cancer Center in North Carolina. At this time, I'll turn the session over to Lou.
Thank you, Prasan. Now, I'm looking at my attendee list up here, and I don't see anyone in my attendee list. I hope there are people out there. I hear the blips coming in. But ACCC was kind enough to invite me to talk about this as sort of an addendum to the pharmacoeconomics project we've been working on for about the last 6 months. And, you know, it's easy to talk about unspecific examples when looking at pharmacoeconomics problems. And as part of our discussion carried us along this path, we wanted to do something that really everyone struggles with, and that's, you know, making a real pharmacoeconomic decision in today's pharmaceutical landscape. Now, I'm going to preface my talk by saying this is going to involve an approach we took here at Cone Health, and I want to make sure that, you know, everyone who's listening kind of gets that idea because, you know, I understand every institution is different and every institution looks at things in a different way. This is the thought process and the approach that we took when we looked at this specific example, and I just wanted to go ahead and clarify that before we went ahead and started things. So as Prasan mentioned, we'd like to thank Millennium for supporting this educational opportunity today. And I have a couple of disclosures to make, and not so that it makes me seem like an expert in the field or that I have a dog or two in the fight, but I am on the Speakers Bureau, and I'm an advisory board member for both Novartis and Amgen. And I think with that information, everyone on the call can probably guess which two drugs we're going to talk about. And it's really been a tough decision for everybody around the country and colleagues that I talk to. You know, we have an agent that's been around for 10 or 12 years or so. We get pretty decent results with. And then a new kid on the block shows up and with some data, and we're going to discuss that data when we get to that part of the talk. And the inference there is that the drug is a lot better than what is currently being utilized, and we took a long, hard look at that, and I'm going to explain that process when we get to it. We both know that these two drugs are approved to prevent skeletal-related events, and they also each have an osteoporosis indication, but for the sake of today's discussion, we're not going to discuss that as much as the oncology indications and the prevention of skeletal-related events. When it appeared on the market, denosumab was being touted by the company as the end-all, be-all thing for prevention of skeletal-related events based on the 3 trials that I'm sure everyone listening is familiar with. But we kind of felt different, and we met with the Amgen folks, it was last January already, so almost a year ago. And, you know, the things around the table of this being the new standard of care and an unmet need really didn't ring well with our physicians, myself, or our research group. We felt as though we had a gold standard in place, and it was up to the new guy or the new kid on the block to show us that this wasn't in fact the case. So really, when we begin this process here at Moses Cone, it wasn't just for this example, but we do it for every new drug or class of drugs that we look at, well, we have to consider three things, and I'm sure everyone will be in agreement with these. You know, there's the clinical implications, then there's the practical implications, and also the financial implications. And when we talk about the clinical implications, we talk about the data and the evidence that supports the drug that we're considering to add to formulary, or considering putting up against a drug that is on formulary. I don't think there's any discrepancy there with respect to how folks look at that stuff. Is there in fact a standard of care in place? And also, what do the guidelines say? You know, as we become more and more guideline driven in oncology, and down the road you'll see that we'll be paid for quality and following guidelines. I'm sorry, did someone need to, someone's not on mute or something? I hear some yelling in the background. Okay, so as I was saying, you know, oncology, we're going to be based on our performance in the future. And part of that performance measure is going to be how well do folks follow guidelines and adhere to guidelines and report their outcomes as a consequence of using those guidelines. So the clinical implications piece is the meat and potatoes stuff we do every day. The other things you need to consider when you're comparing two agents, as in this specific example, are what are the practical indications? Is it an oral drug? Is it given IV? Is it given sub-Q? And in this case, we all know it's an IV versus a sub-Q type administration. And there's costs and charges and costs to patients and other things to consider with those practical implications that are oftentimes overlooked when you look at just a strict cost versus cost type analysis. So we're going to not spend a lot of time on that, but just point that out as something that you do need to consider when making an analysis like this. And then finally, and in my opinion, they should follow this order, the financial implications of what you're going to do. At our place, inpatient is much different than outpatient. Remember, inpatient is more of looking at controlling your expenses. The outpatient department is more about generating revenue. So while we look at cost in the outpatient environment, we're really concerned with what the reimbursement is going to be and what that margin on that reimbursement is going to be to see whether it is financially sane to do this, if that makes sense. So typically, in a pure pharmacoeconomic analysis, you know, we have drug A versus drug B, and we really don't look at things the same way unless if the efficacy is the same, that's one thing to consider. The practical implications are the same. That's another thing to consider. And then it boils down to what the cost, being not the same. That's when that pure pharmacoeconomic analysis is a slam dunk, in my opinion. So, you know, when we have, and typically we think along the lines, you know, the proton pump inhibitors, H2 receptor antagonists, statin drugs, things like that, you know, the efficacy is the same. Practical implications are the same, but in fact, maybe the cost may not be the same. Maybe you get a contract for protonics at your institution that you're paying $1 a dose versus, you know, another proton pump inhibitor where that contract pricing is much higher than that. Obviously, that's a pure pharmacoeconomic analysis from a cost savings perspective. You're going to then, in that case, where the two are deemed equivalent, from an efficacy and practical standpoint, the cost is definitely going to drive you towards one drug or another. And I threw this quote in there because I felt it appropriate for this type of discussion. Just because a drug is cheaper doesn't necessarily mean it's the most cost effective. And what I mean by that is, let's say you have drug A that costs you 20 cents a dose and drug B costs you 50 cents a dose. But with drug A, you know, a lot of the side effects may be elevated blood pressure and diarrhea, nausea and vomiting, where you have to add other agents to that scenario or maybe run the risk of a hospital admission or something like that. A lot of times we overlook those factors and we just look at that pure cost differential and say, oh, drug A is cheaper, we're going to use that drug. So something else to consider. You have to look at really everything that's involved with the administration of that drug as well as the side effects and what the consequences of those side effects may be that may incur an additional cost to therapy in that setting. This one has, I kind of labeled the slide an impure pharmacoeconomic analysis, and I really love this slide. I have a copy of it hanging up in my office, and it really came from the podium talk at ASCO 2 years ago. And the talk was more related to ipilimumab, and the whole, you know, that's sort of a bad word in every oncology clinic nowadays because of the expense of the agent But the physician presenting the data for ipilimumab, you know, the first questions to come from the crowd were about the cost of the drug, and is it cost effective, and, you know, are we spending too much money, et cetera, et cetera. And he mentioned at the podium, he said, well, here's my menu for deciding what's too much money, and he said, you can have a good drug, a cheap drug, or a drug that's available now. So you have those three selections, but you're only allowed to pick two of them. And at the time he was speaking, you didn't really think much of it, but as he went on to explain what he meant, you can really use this every day when you're looking at the cost effectiveness or the cost of pharmacotherapy. And it really does work. If you do this equation, so you want a drug that's good and you want a drug that's cheap. So there's your two, but you're not going to have it now. So you want a drug now and you want a drug that's cheap, then it's not going to be very good. And if you want a drug that's good and you want a drug now, and then it's not going to be very cheap. And he sealed up that controversy by saying, you know, ipilimumab was something that we've not had in melanoma for many, many years. We've not had a good drug that offered a survival advantage, and it's available now. So the consequence of that, and albeit an impure pharmacoeconomic analysis, was that the drug was not going to be cheap. And we kind of joke around about that at our pharmacy task force meetings, but it really is a good type item to keep close by, and you can review this over and over again, and no matter how you spin those three choices, when you pick two of them, the third choice is always not going to be available. So I just throw that out there for food for thought. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to go to that Q&A tab and type those questions in as we go along. So now I'm going to break out each one of those specific items that we talked about a few slides back. And here, when we looked at the clinical data, what we're really talking about is looking at relative numbers versus the absolute difference. And that's got a long-standing type analysis that we do from a statistical standpoint. You know, there's a favorite slide that I use in a lot of my talks that statistics is sort of like an easy way to lie with that mathematical backup. So you make the numbers tell you what you want to hear. And the best example I can use, and we had an exercise with our resident this year. If everyone remembers back in June when the big buzz at ASCO was this exemestane reducing breast cancer by 65%. And it was pretty big news at ASCO. You know, we've not heard reductions of this in quite some time. 65% reduction in the risk of breast cancer when patients took exemestane. And it sounds pretty significant, and it really is pretty significant when you look at 65%. When you go ahead and look at that absolute difference, when you pull that trial, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was somewhere around 0.5% annual incidence of invasive breast cancer in the group that was not treated with exemestane, and about 1/3%, I said 1/3%, 0.33% difference in women who took exemestane. Now, in that analysis, if you want to look at it really hard, exemestane is not a cheap drug by any stretch of the imagination for a year. It's about $400 a month, and albeit it's available generically now, the cost has not gone down very much from that $400 or $425 a month. So now you're asking women to take a drug that costs $400 a month, extrapolate that out for the annual cost of about, what is that, $50,000 a year. I'm sorry, $5,000 a year, for a benefit that in absolute numbers is 0.25%. Yeah, there's a 65% relative risk reduction, but for 0.25% benefit. So that's the point I wanted to hammer home. And if you take this example that we're talking about today, we went ahead and pulled out the absolute numbers. It's easy to say that, you know, drug, and we'll call drug X Xgeva and drug Z Zometa, but, you know, drug X, the marketing approach was there was an 18% reduction in the risk of skeletal-related events. But when you actually go to the trials and pull out those absolute numbers, you know, we're talking 0.1% here, and some of the higher absolute percentage differences, we're talking about 5.8%. I'm just referring to some notes here, which in our opinion was a very small difference to warrant, you know, a drug, and we'll get into the expense later. But it's easy to tout relative numbers, so we always ask the question, what's the absolute difference here? What are the actual numbers that we're looking at, rather than saying and it reduces something relatively by 18, 20, or 65% in the case of that exemestane example. Relative numbers can be deceptive. While a great marketing tool, I think they can be very deceptive when you're trying to look at drug A versus drug B in terms of a pharmacoeconomic analysis. And so it raises the question, is Xgeva truly clinically better? And you can certainly argue the case one way or the other, but in our opinion, we had a drug that was safe over long-term use, and when I say long-term use, we've had patients on zoledronic acid here for 8 or 10 years without consequence. And now we've got a new drug on the market that really doesn't have a lot in the way of long-term safety data. And I mean safety data, if you recall the Zometa story, it came on the market, it was a potent bisphosphonate, we started using it like there was no tomorrow, only to find out 3.5, 4 years later that there was this problem with patients' teeth falling out. And that's what I mean by long-term safety. So now we've got the experience with this particular agent, and we know what some of the side effects are and some of the consequences are. We could do a better job promoting to patients to have that dental exam done prior to initiation of therapy, following up with the dentist on regular intervals. While there's still not good data on what to do to bridge a patient around a dental procedure, again, no drug is better than drug in that setting when you don't know what the consequence is going to be. So we'll typically hold zoledronic acid around that. And that part of that long-term safety is that long-term experience with the drug to know what to do in the absence of good evidence to support holding the drug around a dental procedure. We don't know what the consequences are, so we've taken the stance on holding the agent if patients need dental work. We don't have the luxury of that with this newer drug, which was one of the other things that was put on the concern side of this evaluation. And then, we say it time and time again in oncology, statistical significance does not necessarily mean clinical significance. And it's wonderful to have a p-value with 82 zeros before the 1, but we all know in a statistical analysis, all that number reflects is the probability that the results achieved in a trial were not gotten by chance. So whether it's 0.049 or 0.00000000001, the only thing you can say about that data is that it was statistically significant. And nothing annoys me more that when there's a lot of zeros, when someone says it's very absolutely, positively, very highly statistically significant. When I was trained many, many moons ago, data was either statistically significant or it was not statistically significant, regardless of the number of zeros. All the number of zeros say is to give you a good idea that those results were probably not gotten by chance. So we have to remember that and keep that in mind as well. Just because there's a lot of zeros doesn't mean there's a clinically significant outcome involved there. And the biggest question on the table for us when we were discussing the two agents is what happened in myeloma. We all know Zometa, highly regarded by all the myeloma groups and the International Myeloma Working Group and the Mayo Clinic. They've adopted this as, you've got myeloma, you're getting zoledronic acid. And while excuses can be made and criticisms can be made of that third trial that put Zometa up against Xgeva that contained a small subset of myeloma patients, the question in our mind is why didn't it work in a purely lytic type environment? We all know myeloma is a purely lytic bone disease when bone involvement is there, and we know Zometa works very good. I don't think we have a clear answer as to why it didn't work. Now, I can say that Amgen has gone on to do a study specifically in myeloma, and we'll be curious to see how those results pan out when the results of that trial are available. But just some of I just wanted to throw in a few of the things that run through our minds when we look at comparisons of this nature. It's not only about one drug being more expensive or one drug being reimbursed at more money than the other. There are a whole host of other things that impact the clinic, impact the patient, impact your bottom line. So all those things have to be taken into consideration. Some of the clinic-related issues, the IV infusion, albeit a short IV infusion versus the subcutaneous injection. Again, another great marketing tool. People evidently think you just pull up to the clinic, you roll up your sleeve, they shoot you in the arm, and you're on your way. there was a very good trial done by Rob Adamson and his colleagues up at St. Barnabas Hospital when Aranesp came to the market, and they actually looked at the impact of subcutaneous injection. And when they did that time analysis, not only in the clinic, but there was a questionnaire given towards the patient's caregivers and the patients themselves, that quick subcutaneous injection accounted for some 4 to 6 hours of time from the time the caregiver left the house to pick up the patient, to bring them to the clinic, to wait for their labs, to get into the shot room, to get their shot, and then to be on their way and to get back home. So while in theory, a subcutaneous injection is a quick thing to do, in the reality of the situation, it really does impact the patient, the caregiver, and the institution. I know oftentimes we have patients waiting in line to get their Neulasta shots or their Aranesp shots, and those are similarly are subcutaneous injections. But when you do enough of them, there can be delays and bottlenecks, et cetera, in the lab, at the shot room, et cetera. So just another thing to consider. The advertising was that this intravenous infusion, oh my God, it's 15 minutes. And, it's oftentimes around here when we're busy in the morning, patients are sitting for 15 or 20 minutes in the lobby just to get called back to the labs to have their lab drawn. So, again, you want to compare apples to apples in that setting and not be swayed by, the marketing tools of a quick injection versus a 15-minute infusion. There's really a lot more involved when you're trying to compare those two instances. And then looking at the chair time, the other thing we looked at was, Zometa eats up a lot of chair time. Well, you got to remember you're paid for chair time. Another thing to consider when you're factoring in the finances of this comparison, chair time you're paid very well for. Subcutaneous injection you're not paid very well for. And patient wait times I've already addressed in the labs. That's all part of that wait time that impacts the patient. So that the take-home point for this slide really is, while a 15-minute injection seems like an eternity, in reality, when at the end of the day, when you add up the numbers, there's probably a very similar time frame and a very similar impact to patients receiving just that 15-minute infusion of Zometa versus that quick subcutaneous injection of Xgeva. Something else you have to consider. And again, at our place, when we looked at it, the wait times for folks is highly variable on any given day, and I'm sure at your respective institutions, that's a similar scenario. But I will guarantee that anybody listening to me today, patients don't come running in the door, they get their shot in the arm, and they turn around and go back on their way. So just another thing to consider. When we talk about the financial implications, being a 340B account, I put our numbers up here for the sake of comparison. You can see where zoledronic acid, the cost here is about half of what it costs us for a dose of denosumab. And realizing, of course, that we get billed at ASP plus a minimal percentage on top of that, you can see where it's probably financially lucrative to do denosumab over zoledronic acid. But in our opinion, we didn't really think that's fair to the patient to select that as the only criteria when looking at the comparison to these two drugs. And the other thing we want to caution about here, too, is a lot of times when the pharma reps come in, and I'm not here to badmouth the pharma reps today or the pharmaceutical industry, a lot of the analyses they provide with that stipulation that, they're looking at your patient population as being 100% Medicare. And while that's a great analysis if your patient population is 100% Medicare, not very many places are, you have to take that into consideration as well. Here in Greensboro, we run about 40 to 45% Medicare on any given month, and you have to take into account what the private payers are paying. So, that ASP plus may change to an AWP model for United Healthcare or for one of the other private payers, and you have to take that into consideration as well. While it's nice to look at that ASP plus 4 or whatever pennies they're throwing at us these days, keep in mind that your patient population is not all Medicare, and you do have to take a step back and look at what your payer mix is based on this financial analysis. And then again, you have to look at how much is too much. I alluded to the ipilimumab argument earlier, and when you look at that particular drug, we've had many years go by without anything good for melanoma, and now we finally have a decent drug that has a survival benefit in a very difficult patient population to treat. And how do you put a price on that? We all know as pharmacists that there's a lot of research that goes on to these agents, and I don't know what the exact calculation is at the end of the day to arrive at that cost price to institutions. But, you know, it's really like with anything else. If you want a survival, you really have to see what tumor type you're treating and, you know, how much then is too much. And believe it or not, in June of last year at ASCO, there were 2 abstracts published, one looking at the metastatic castrate-resistant prostate cancer study of Zometa versus Xgeva, and the other abstract looked at the metastatic breast cancer study. Now, the Amgen folks will criticize both of these, that these were funded by Novartis, and I'll take the hit on that. Both of these were funded by Novartis. However, the company that provided the pharmacoeconomic analysis was a small pharmacoeconomics company located out of Baltimore, I believe they are, and it's PharMerit North America, a very small company. I think they have about 25 employees total. And they looked at that decision tree type Markov analysis, taking into account things like drug and administration costs for each of the malignancy types. They looked at it more so from a managed care perspective rather than from a Medicare perspective, which is, you know, maybe not real world, but looked at it from that financial benefit type thing. And they incorporated the average or related costs of a skeletal-related event in both of those populations, and you can see that ranges quite dramatically from about $4,000 to over $20,000, depending on the event, with the goal of looking at the cost per quality-adjusted life years gained. And interestingly, what they found was what was confirmed in a lot of the trials. There were fewer skeletal-related events with denosumab, more quality-adjusted life years, lower skeletal-related event costs, but there are also higher drug-related costs. And when they made their pharmacoeconomic calculation and they looked at that incremental cost per quality-adjusted life year gained, you can see the numbers there. It was over $1 million in the metastatic castrate-resistant prostate cancer trial, and almost $750,000, or what, 2/3 of $1 million in the metastatic breast cancer trial. And I know what everybody's saying out there. Okay, Lou, what the heck does that mean? Well, if you all remember the trial, it wasn't really a trial. It was actually an analysis done back in the Archives of Internal Medicine back in 2003, analyzing that fact. How much is worth, you know, is the bang worth the buck? And back then it was determined at the time that the cost of a good medical intervention, now keep in mind this is about 8 or 9 years ago, the cost of a good medical intervention should be around $50,000 to $100,000 per quality adjusted life year. And if I go back, you can see where the prostate trial, the calculation came up to about 10 times that amount. And in the metastatic breast cancer trial, you can see where it's about 6 times that amount, depending on if you take the lower end of that argument or the higher end of the argument. And now the question, I think, in my mind needs to be asked, does this benchmark need to be changed? I think with a lot of these higher cost agents being approved over the last 4 or 5 years, I think maybe that does need to be looked at and maybe needs to be reevaluated and to determine what actually is the cost of a good medical intervention. You know, if you remember in the old days, I'll get back to melanoma because it's a pretty bad and gloomy disease. When you had nothing, we gave patients drugs that cost money with really no incremental benefit. It was more toxicity inducing and horrible course of events for patients to go through a dacarbazine-based regimen with, you know, absolutely no light at the end of the tunnel. So now we've got drugs that are good in that disease, and, you know, what is the cost of a good medical intervention? And maybe we need to start looking at these things not globally, but by disease site and see, you know, we go back to the exemestane example, is $5,000 per year enough to warrant a 0.25% reduction in a woman's risk of breast cancer? I mean, that's certainly a great question. And again, 8 years ago, the economy was much different than it is today. You know, so $50,000 to $100,000 may have been a good number back then, but in my opinion, I do think we probably need to take another look at that and see if we need to change this benchmark. So just to summarize here, again, I'm going to hammer it home. While each institution is different, please make sure you look at the entire picture. It's not a matter of you know, Zometa being $600 and denosumab being $1,200. That's a piece of the puzzle. You really need to have all the pieces gathered to put together a clear picture. I didn't talk too much about the guidelines, but in our opinion here, if the drug was touted to be the next latest, greatest thing since sliced bread, if you go to any of the guidelines, the ASCO guidelines in breast cancer do make reference to the trials that showed a statistically significant benefit of denosumab over zoledronic acid, yet their comments section reads something to the effect of no recommendations can be made as to which bone-modifying agent is better than the other, in spite of 3 clinical trials showing statistically significant difference in reduction of skeletal-related events. If you take a look at the prostate cancer guidelines, if you take a look at the breast cancer NCCN guidelines, the lung cancer guidelines, they all make mention of the trials showing statistically better reduction in skeletal-related events with denosumab, yet at the end of the day, they don't make a recommendation one way or another. Now, do I think denosumab is a better drug than zoledronic acid or vice versa? All I can speak to is the fact that we've had a drug that we've been using for 10 to 12 years now with great success, and I just think that denosumab being new to the market, we do need that long-term safety data. We do need some more experience with it to make sure that it is a safe and effective drug for our patients. We know statistically it's effective and maybe an inference towards it being clinically better, but I really think more time is needed before we can make a true decision on it. And again, make sure you're comparing apples to apples. Those Medicare type analyses are great if all of your patients are 65 and older and all of them have Medicare. I've typically found that that's not the case in a lot of institutions, and a lot of institutions have a lower Medicare percentage of patients than we do here in Greensboro, so just something else to consider. And drug acquisition cost, again, in keeping with looking at that entire picture, should not be the only factor to decide that one drug is better than another. So at the Cone Health Cancer Center, what was our outcome? It's not that we restricted anything. We added Xgeva to our formulary without restrictions, and the physicians really weren't eager to get on board with it. We've had a slow type uptake. We may have about 15 or 20 patients on it now, and we do have it as a niche drug right now. We do reserve it for use for whatever reason the physicians decided to use it in those patients who have reduced renal function where they don't meet that 30 mils per minute cutoff for zoledronic acid. That's where the doctors consider using it here. Have we used it in other folks with good renal function? Sure we have. I mean, it's got the indication to be used. We don't restrict it or question the physician in any way. And we're, again, gaining experience with the agent because we are not totally convinced here that this is absolutely much better drug than what is currently available and that we've had a number of years of great success with. Moving forward, we are looking forward again to that multiple myeloma data. It just seems strange to us that in a disease where that should have been a slam dunk, it wasn't. You can criticize the trial all you want. The bottom line is that there was really not any difference between groups, zoledronic acid versus denosumab. I think with a pure trial with just myeloma patients, when you're looking at the drugs head-to-head in that pure population of patients, we may see a difference, but again, we're not going to know until that trial's been completed and we get the results. So with that, it wasn't a very long presentation. I'm sure it was boring for a few of you, but just wanted to give you, the ACCC asked me to give the group and the members sort of a real-world example on how one institution approaches a pharmacoeconomic analysis, and I try to make it simple and dummy it down for everybody. We could look at calculations and numbers all day long, but typically, I know most places don't do that. When they get into a room with physicians, nurses, and try to review these agents, again, you have to look at all the pieces of the puzzle before you put it together and come up with your decision. So with that, I hope it was helpful this afternoon. I don't see any questions prompted. And I'll turn it back over to Brisson.
Thank you, Lou. This concludes the webinar. This webinar is supported by an educational grant from Millennium, the Takeda Oncology Company. For more information on this project, please visit the Oncology Pharmacy Education Network website. Finally, please complete the evaluation before leaving the webinar, which will appear at the end of the session. Thank you all so much for attending, and I hope that the webinar has been beneficial to you and your staff. Thank you.
Are the blips people going in and out?
Yes, it's people exiting the
Gotcha.
question. Looks like we still have quite a lot of people online.